Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome to today's episode of In This Body. Today we're joined by Dr. Holly Richmond. Holly is a somatic psychotherapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified sex therapist, and also a certified sex therapy supervisor. She sits on the clinical board of directors for Dame Products and is an associate director of Modern Sex Therapy Institutes. This unique combination of credentials lets Holly focus on clients' cognitive processes and mind-body health. Holly doesn't know this, but I spent a lot of time already learning from her as I completed my training as a certified sex therapist with the Modern Sex Therapy Institute, of which Holly is an associate director. Therefore, I have firsthand benefited from the wisdom Holly has acquired. In addition to teaching numerous sexual health-related subjects, she works with women, men, couples, and gender-diverse individuals on relationship and sexuality issues, offering sex therapy, sexual health coaching, and retreats nationally and internationally too. Her treatment specialties include low libido, sexual dysfunction, compulsive sexuality, often called addiction, the intersection of sexuality and psychedelics, desire discrepancy in couples, recovery from sexual trauma, and alternative relationship models. Holly is also the author of Reclaiming Pleasure, a sex-positive guide for moving past sexual trauma and living a passionate life. It is an innovative book that looks at both somatic and psychological factors in survivors' erotic recovery. It is a book that I recommend to clients in my private practice as well. Because of her extensive expertise, she is a sought-after consultant in the sex tech industry. She is seen as a pioneer in the clinical exploration of sex and technology and how they work together as human sexuality evolves in the 21st century. Each interlinked facet of her work is grounded in a sex-positive perspective. All sex is good sex as long as it is consensual and pleasurable. This non-judgmental position allows her to assist clients in discovering their actual needs, desires, and personal path to wellness. Holly, I'm thrilled to have you with us today. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. The first question I wanted to ask you was if there was any specific moment in your life or in your experience where it was really solidified for you that you wanted to pursue a career that was centered around somatics and embodiment.
Yes, there was. It was sitting in my therapy office at the Santa Barbara Rape Crisis Center, and with a specific client where I realized that we had done a great job of working through her trauma, but that she was still having challenges somatically, and that I wasn't sure how to help her with her sex life. So in that way, that lit a fire, and I was like, okay, I found a PhD in somatic psychology. I started my sex therapy certification, just because I felt like I can't treat trauma if I'm not treating the body, and I can't treat the body unless I know about human sexuality. So to me, those three pieces are just foundational to all of the work I do.
How do you and your work end up weaving some of the cognitive, it sounds like you were trained in prior to, into the pieces of somatic work? Because that bridge is oftentimes, there are people like you and a few others who are kind of leading trainings and building that bridge, but weaving the cognitive and the traditional with somatics and sexuality is often not done.
Yeah, and it's a continual work in progress. And of course, yes, I came in, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, went through my master's in clinical psychology. That's very top down, right? Very cognitively based for any of your listeners who don't know what top down means. So in most therapy, we start with the head and then we incorporate the body. In somatic psychology, we start with the body and then move up to the psyche. So for me, I love stories. So I come at this from a journalism background. So still that storytelling is in my bones. So it's not like I'm leaving out the psyche, leaving out emotion, leaving out the cognitive, but it's really prioritizing or at least holding in parallel process what the body is doing. So a lot of somatic therapists are going to be big on breath work and guided meditations, and so much of your therapy session will be based in the body without a lot of cognitive feedback. I have tried that, and with some clients who appreciate that approach, I will do it, but that is not how I practice somatic psychology. For me, it's just a continual tracking of the nervous system and figuring out, do we need to upregulate or downregulate? I give cognitive homework and I always give somatic homework. So for me, just keeping you in your body and not offering a lot of reflection or insight to the psyche doesn't necessarily work. So again, I try to work with those in parallel process.
I love that because that is something that I have found in my own experience. And sometimes the clients will come and they really want someone who's somatic. And I'm like, I'm going to actually bring that cognitive place in so that we have a framework of understanding. And it's for me, I kind of view it as like building the basement. Like we
Yeah.
need that structure. For people who don't know, I would love if you could explain some of the difference, because you just touched in it there, the difference between a traditional therapist, a sex therapist, and then a somatic psychotherapist or licensed marriage and family therapist could also be more the traditional, how those things are different and how the experience is different too as a client.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's start at the beginning. So a licensed marriage and family therapist in most states and countries, you have to have a master's degree to get the license as a therapist. What that does is a general training in psychotherapy. So, and then within your master's program, you're going to specialize in children, in families, in substance abuse, whatever your specialty is. I chose to focus on sexual trauma. So in the state of California, when I lived there and got my first license, you had to do 3,000 hours of internship, which is a chunk, like that. It's a long process. So again, I did most of mine at the Santa Barbara Rape Crisis Center. And as I said when we started, there was just a point for me where I was like, I need to learn more. Like, I am so not done. I don't understand enough about the body, and I certainly don't understand enough about human sexuality. So in most clinical psychology programs, you're going to get 8 hours, maybe 16, if you're lucky, in human sexuality. And it is really just the basics, helps to frame things in sex positivity. But it was certainly not enough. So back then I did my sex therapy certification with ASECT, and that's 350 hours. And really just a very broad foundational training. But even within sex therapy training, sex therapists are going to have specialties. Sexual trauma within sex therapy, non-monogamy, divorce, infidelity, LGBTQIA, neurodivergence and sexuality, you name it. So again, there's still specialties. The PhD in somatic psychology, there's no license associated with that. That's just extra education for me. I knew I needed to understand the body better, but really, to me, again, I can't take my head out of this. So I'm very cognitive in my approach with somatics. Again, very clinical psychology base but with a body focus.
Okay. That
Yeah.
kind of pulled them all apart.
Yes.
I wanted to ask this question because it is in there and it's oftentimes not spoken about in those 8 hours when you're trained as a licensed marriage and family therapist. For me in Canada, I got zero training in sexuality in my master's. It wasn't even touched upon. But I would love to hear from you why pleasure has become such an important part of your practice and how it got tied into your practice. If it was in that moment with that client in Santa Barbara, or there's another place where you were like, actually, pleasure needs to be a part of this conversation for me as a therapist.
Yeah. It wasn't that client. Pleasure really came in only when I started the ASECT sex therapy certification. I had never even considered it. I mean, how crazy does that sound? So just for reference, I started my master's in clinical psychology when I was 38 years old. So I came into this late in the game. I had been having sex most of my adult life, of course. I knew sometimes it felt good. That was never the priority to me because it was always, I was born in the 70s. It's like, what does the guy want? And I don't know how much that really changed until the early 2000s, if we're honest about it. Now we have the language of pleasure. Learning sex therapy, I learned the language of pleasure. I learned about the clitoris. I learned different ways to experience pleasure. And it was really not until I met those clients who came into me and just said, I don't care if I ever have sex again, like my libido is nowhere. Help me figure this out, that I designed, so within my reclaiming pleasure protocol, I designed that Discover Your Sexual template, which looks at desire, the psychological process of wanting, and arousal, the physiological process of wanting. And that's really where I grabbed a hold of pleasure and was like, oh my gosh, this can't be ignored anymore.
Could you spend a little bit more time actually talking about your book and that process that's in your book, Reclaiming Pleasure? Yeah, can you speak about how you bring in the somatic aspects of it and what that book offers people?
Yeah, so Reclaiming Pleasure, a sex positive guide for reclaiming pleasure after sexual trauma, was really an offshoot of my dissertation, which came from the Rape Crisis Center. So there, my dissertation was the recovery of sexual health after sexual assault, specifically from an embodied perspective. So that's how I brought the somatic piece in. It was a grounded theory, qualitative analysis. And what I discovered in that analysis is there were really three prongs to helping survivors feel better, and reclaim passion, reclaim a positive life, really feel like they were thriving instead of just surviving. And those were control, pleasure, connection. So what, Ailey, what you and I were just talking about is pleasure, and how I broke that down was into desire and arousal. So again, what do I find sexy versus what turns me on? What are the psychological processes there? What are the physiological processes there? How is it different for people? How is it different for assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth, for queer, for even asexual? So really looking at all of the pieces of how people turn themselves on. What of that is sexual in nature and what's erotic in nature? And I know you and I have talked about eroticism and eros before. So eroticism can be sexual, but it doesn't have to be. It's really about life force, vitality, vivacity, creativity, imagination. Esther Perel is really the expert here. If you don't know her work, go read.
I would love to hear you speak about the stumble blocks you have found with people when we're speaking about those elements of control and pleasure and connection. What often gets in the way when you're kind of working, it sounds like, that model with people?
Mm-hmm. So control, this is interesting. For most people, most survivors in particular, we're very much overfunctioners. We're human doings versus human beings. We've got control pretty wrapped up, and it is tight, and it's going to be around food, and it's going to be around exercise, and it's going to be around what our house looks like, where we will go to eat, what people we will hang out with, just because we're trying to hold on very tight. Our world is a little bit rigid, right? Just so that we can feel safe. So my work most of the time is helping people relinquish control, feeling more safe in different environments, doing different things with their body, doing different things sexually. Sometimes it's the opposite way, and people are in a little bit of collapse or laxity, chaos, and we're helping them to feel more in control. But usually it's from the rigid to the flexible. Pleasure within there is what we just talked about. Most people have never even considered what they like sexually, especially women, especially women over 30 or over 35. We just, we didn't have the internet. We didn't know that sex is supposed to be pleasurable. There was just so much information lacking. And just disclaimer with the internet, obviously everything you read is not true. Please do not get all of your sexual health information from Google or YouTube or TikTok. And then connection. So control is kind of the logical place we start. That's very systematic. People understand it. Pleasure is kind of the fun place. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm discovering something about myself. I can really feel the evolution here. The connection is when my clients are like, holy shit, I've got to go out and do this in the world. Like, I've got to be flexible. I have to learn about boundaries, reciprocity. So connection is when I'm sending them out, whether it's to date, whether it's to reconnect with their long-term partner in a different way, even connecting with themselves in a really vulnerable and authentic way. It's the hard work. The connection piece is definitely the most difficult.
I'll start with control because I'm curious. How do you support people to relinquish that when so much sense of safety and sense of self is wound up in that? And there's so many cultural forces that are like really kind of highlighting discipline or rigidity in a lot of ways. How you play with actually supporting someone to let some of that well-constructed safety mechanism go.
Yeah. So the easiest answer is tiny step by tiny step, breath by breath. So I will give homework every week. And let's say someone runs 6 days a week for 1 hour. So I'm going to ask her to run 5 days a week. And what if we do 45 minutes? Or instead of running, can we just do the recumbent bike? It might not even be taking the exercise away. It's just helping her substitute different things, or him. As far as like food goes, orthorexia, I see a lot. So anyone who doesn't know, orthorexia is really, it's controlled rigid eating, but it looks very healthy. Like, it is so sneaky. And I want people to eat healthy. I'm not against not eating healthy, but the rigidity when you see it. So if I hear a lot of, I can't eat that, what if you eat half the cookie today? Right? What if you, instead of eating your normal granola and yogurt every morning, let's see what would happen if you ate a waffle. So it's just, again, it's tiny, playing with these little elements of control, and within the bedroom too. So if you always masturbate this way, let's try masturbating in the shower. If you always have sex with your partner this way, let's try what this position would feel like.
I love how you bring it to the place of sexuality and just like starting to break down those control elements there, because I feel like oftentimes people don't consider that their sexuality could be quite controlled or just as rigid as their exercise regime.
Yeah. A great sex therapist said this, like this saying has been out there, and I wish I knew who I could ascribe it to. Show me how someone has sex and I'll show you how they live life. Right? There's so much information in how people have sex.
I want to bring us back because it's been a thread throughout and I haven't asked about it. You have worked a lot with sexual assault survivors and those who have sexual trauma. What is one way that you kind of perceive that healing journey to begin?
Awareness. So I think, and I was just speaking about this yesterday, the trajectory that I work through is awareness, understanding, behavior change. Most survivors of sexual trauma don't make it into my office. And when I mean my office, Zoom, I work virtually most of the time, for a decade, 10 years. Because we have such a misinformed idea of what sexual trauma is. We think it's violent. Most of the time it's not violent. It's just violating. Most of the time there are no bruises, bumps, scratches, cuts. It's just violating. It's a huge boundary violation. Our body shuts down in that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. So the 10 years is when the survivor, he experiences a sexual trauma. He internalizes the shame and thinks he was in some way complicit in that, because he might not have said no. He might not have fought back. All of a sudden his brain's like, well, I guess that didn't count. I've got to figure this out. So he goes about the next 10 years trying to figure it out. But what he ends up with is a lot of psychosomatic pain. So IBS, headaches, erectile dysfunction for her, vulvodynia, vaginismus, maybe fear of childbirth, fear of needles, or substance use issues, or inability to hold down a job, or inability to maintain a healthy relationship. And then they're like, there's a moment for them when the penny drops and they're like, I wonder if all of these symptoms have something to do with that sexual trauma that happened a decade ago. Because it's just been so minimized, so pushed down, so embedded in shame in the body. So I think my short answer to my long answer is awareness.
I would love, because I have you here, if you could speak to, because it's something that I have often in my clinical practice and have often had, and I don't feel like there's a lot of resources around it, is the process that often people go through of befriending their perpetrator, the person who violated them. That phenomenon is so not spoken about, it's not understood. And I'm curious how you support someone in that process of reconciling, oh, this is how I responded, was more of a tend to befriend approach after the violating incident.
Right. How I usually treat that is really to spend a session, 2, 3, or 4 on the fawn response.
Mhm.
The fawn response is so deeply embedded, and I would say particularly for women, and I try not to be too gendered in my work. But we're taught to be nice. We're taught to not ruffle feathers, be a good girl. Because if we're not, we're called a bitch or whatever, like if we're using our voice. So the fawn response is being compliant. It's going along to getting along, but that is in service to not getting hurt worse. So what typically happens, I've had many, many clients who experience, let's say, a date rape, and they go home, they're kind of in a freeze state, and their perpetrator texts them, "Hey, I had a great time, would love to see you again." And in that moment, they text back, "Yeah, thank you so much. Had fun." Right? And then all of a sudden she's on the phone with me, however many years later, and she's like, "I could never report that because I sent him a text back, and I've actually chatted with him off and on throughout the years. I've never wanted to see him again, and I feel scared when I'm next to him, but I was nice to him."
That piece, how do you support someone in reconciling that next piece? You've named the psychoeducation, but are there other elements that come in?
It's really about befriending their body. So
Mhm.
understanding how that fawn response was saving them, wasn't
Mhm.
trying to betray them. They didn't do the right thing. So they'll be sitting there with me week after week. Well, I didn't do the right thing. I didn't do this. I didn't do this. I did do this. I know they did the right thing because they are sitting here in front of me and they are safe.
Yeah, it's often that piece of honoring, like the body has a wisdom, even though we might not mentally understand it or cognitively understand where it went, but it has led us to safety. And i.e., we're here in this moment and anchoring into that. Is there any advice that you would have for someone who has experienced sexual trauma or feels stuck in one of these kind of a fawn state or a different survival state, like a fight or a flight or a freeze?
Mhm. So I think with sexual trauma, this is one area of therapy that I really would recommend a specialist with some sex therapy background, just because it can be a little tricky. So let's speak specifically about arousal non-concordance. So for anyone who doesn't know, so let's take a sexual trauma survivor, and when he was abused as an 11-year-old, his perpetrator would spank him, but in a sexual way. And now he likes to spank his partners, and he has all of these fantasies and watches porn about spanking. And every time he does that, he ends up in a shame spiral. So taking that to someone without sex therapy education or without a really solid foundation in sexuality could shame that too. They could be like, "Oh yeah, you never need to do that again. Let's take that off the table." Or for a lot of trauma survivors, they're going to have forced seduction fantasies, which we used to call rape fantasies, very, very common. But taking that to someone who is not sex positive is a really dangerous place to be, because they could increase the shame, say, "Oh my gosh, don't do that again. We need to get rid of that," instead of helping the client to understand it. And sometimes it's not a great coping mechanism. It's not a great fantasy to have, so we'll shelve it for a while. But there's always the option to bring it back if we can engage in spanking without shame.
That process of kind of engaging with the fantasy and deciding is it helpful, harmful. How do you work with that with the client? Because I'm imagining that is like highly unique and very personable.
It is. It is. It's honestly, when they engage with it, how do they feel afterwards? Like,
Okay.
that is, how does your nervous system feel after
Mhm.
you've masturbated, after you've done this with your partner, after you've had these fantasies? That just tells us so much information. And again, we'll shelve it for weeks or months, and then, because it's usually their peak sexual experience. So if someone has a fantasy that's so embedded, it's been their go-to, they have their strongest orgasms when they're thinking of this fantasy, it's going to take like typically 4 months to bring in some other fantasies, to expand our erotic template. Let's just try. But then they're frustrated. They're like, "Man, I haven't had an orgasm like I have when I watch spanking." So we'll bring it back in, see if they can engage with it differently. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't.
I love how this resonates or relates to the aspect of control that you spoke about. Can we expand and be more flexible, even in our fantasy or the images we bring forward in our sexuality?
Yeah.
Um, you said something, and it's such a classic somatic thing, like, where do you feel that in your body? But I worked with so many people who don't know how to answer that question, or I even think back to my younger self, and I would have not had any idea what that even meant. How do you guide someone into awareness of their body? Are there some tips that you have for people if they are struggling to answer that question? Where do you feel this in your body?
Mm-hmm. So I use my nervous system spectrum a lot. So 0 is very depressed, almost catatonic, very shut down somatically. 10 is full on panic attack, very anxious. So first, I help every session to figure out where my client is on that spectrum, because it's only from that place that we know, do we need to upregulate or do we need to downregulate? A lot of people are just, yeah, where do you feel it in your body? And then they don't know what to do with it because they have no idea where we are. If we don't know where we are, we can't know where we're going, but we want to get in that 4 to 6 flexibility range. So from there, I might do a body scan and be very specific about, do you feel warm? Do you feel cold? Like in your belly, in your hips, in your knees, in your feet? Is it tingly? Is it pinchy? Is it, what does it feel like? Is it flowy? Just giving them some words to put to different areas of their body. And if I do a body scan, again, it's bottom up. So it's from the feet to the head, just so we're engaging the body before we're engaging the brain.
I love that.
Yeah. And then if we're like, okay, we need to down regulate, there's going to be your weighted blankets, your slow stretching, maybe a slow walk outside if we need to up regulate, dancing, singing, cold shower. So just using, a lemon drop, a ginger chew, something sour, a little spicy, just figuring out where are we going.
It sounds like you have a lot of somatic kind of homework based approaches, like really blended in, which is so nice to hear because I find that to be quite unique. There's oftentimes the somatic approaches you use in session, but not so much ones that you carry out after. I do want to ask though, when you are supporting someone to feel into their body and using some of these approaches or some of the homework as well, are there stories that oftentimes really get in the way? Or narratives that people have that really stop them from getting in their body? And I'm curious if you could speak to some of the ones that you've noticed the most in supporting so many people.
Yeah, absolutely. The stories get in our way. And, one of my favorite questions is, who would you be without your story? So really coming back to those core elements of self. So if the story is getting in the way, just be a core negative belief system, or it could literally be, when I'm trying to do the homework that you gave me, I'm having flashbacks of my trauma. So we need to figure out like what that story is. Core negative belief systems, we're working with that more psychologically. The flashbacks, I would use somatic techniques to kind of, again, contain that, not minimize it, but I have a worry box. So we would put that in, if this is a somatic technique, put it in the worry box and know that we can go back to engage in it when we're ready, but it's not running the show anymore.
Okay. Are there cultural aspects that you feel like really stop people from getting in their body?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, um, instead of speaking specifically to different cultures, I think I can just say that there are some cultures that really appreciate dance or appreciate ritual. Those people are going to have a little bit easier time getting into their body versus societies that are just very cognitive. They're more about the human doing than the human being. Those people are just so heady. And I used to be a heady person as well. So it just takes practice. Yeah.
For someone who is unaware, I'm sure by listening they get some of the links. But why is embodiment so important for the expression of sexuality? Because in mainstream conceptions of sexuality, being in your body isn't really talked about at all. Could you break that down for someone?
Yeah. So to me, embodiment really bridges the gap between the challenges experienced in the psyche and the pain expressed in the body. So we're just trying, again, embodiment is that bridge and understanding both. So again, awareness, understanding, behavior change. To be embodied is more than being in your body. It's feeling safe, strong, whole, authentic, vulnerable, risk-taking, all of the things. That's what it feels like to be in your body or to be embodied. Um, People who aren't embodied, you can see that. And a lot of survivors are not embodied. So they will call themselves clumsy. They will say they have a bad memory. They will be so distracted during sex, worrying about body image or their to-do list. And there's modalities, there are interventions that we can use for all of these. It's pretty easy to see. And again, that is a slow process, though. Getting someone to be in their body is not like, oh, here's an intervention. This is months and months and months, but it's so well worth it. And then they come out, especially with sex on the other side, going, I've never had sex like this in my life. And a lot of times that's just slowing things down.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain more of the process when you're working with someone and they are quite disconnected or they are having those flashbacks, how you bring them into the body? Because I'm imagining that it's like a push and pull. There's parts of them that want to and parts of them that don't want to, and how you kind of create the container so someone actually stays engaged in that process and doesn't go, this is too overwhelming or too hard, or it's not happening fast enough.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing we would do is start with the environment and really make sure they are being intentional about creating environment for, let's say I've given them homework that's touching themselves. If we had gotten to a place in that protocol where they were touching their genitals and they're starting to have these flashbacks, we would take that off the table again. We would go back just to stroking your body, kind of doing a self version of sensate focus. Where they're touching their body, they're learning what kind of touch they like, what's not okay. We would figure out, what do you think it is that is spurring these flashbacks? Is it just being quiet? If it is, if it's too hard right now to just be quiet and be in your body, let's put on some music. Let's give you something tactile, like a soft, fuzzy blanket. Let's use some other things that can take that attention away a little bit, because yeah, being in your body or just sitting with yourself is too much. And you just reminded me, meditation is not great for everyone. Like I think we've been sold this idea that everybody needs to meditate. Definitely not. So many survivors that I've sat with, meditation is just like that's a straight shot to the moon of Trigger Town, right? Like I'm so dysregulated right now. I can't stand this. So meditation is not for everyone. And we've just, as a clinician, you've got to figure out, can this work? Can this not? If it's not meditation, what mindfulness practice could I bring in and initiate at this point?
What mindfulness practices do you suggest to people who can't meditate? I kind of found that out the hard way after spending 2 months in silence. I was like, probably wasn't the best for my well-being overall. I mean, to a point it was, but then it led me to learn, actually, for my system, there are better practices of mindfulness that are here. And I would love to hear from you. Which are some ones that you suggest if you have kind of a toolkit for people when they're like, I can't meditate, or I just completely disassociate. And so it isn't a practice of meditation. It's just disassociation or looping in my mind.
Right, right. Typically, I'm going to bring in something somatic right away. So walking, even running, swimming, being in the shower. There just has to be something else going on. Again, that tactical piece, listening to something. Meditation can be listening to music, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be like woo-woo music. It can be any kind of music. Being mindful when we eat. That can be a great one for some people and really hard for other people. Being mindful just when we're sitting at our desk, like organizing our desk so it's a way that feels good to us. I mean, it can be the tiniest little things. So mindfulness is really just a practice in presence without judgment. That's how I defined it. A practice in presence without judgment. If I can get someone to be present without judgment for 1 minute, that's a win. And then we just build from there.
What other pieces of homework do you offer people that are somatic oriented?
Oh, outside of movement-based, things like humming, writing. So that could be journaling, drawing for my artistic people. Sometimes it needs to be things like a striptease class, a burlesque class, pole dancing, a normal dance class, joining a support group. So anything, and I know you're like, how is that somatic? But for a lot of people, I'm thinking of my people who are very isolated and don't like to go out. So joining some kind of community group, doesn't have to be a support group, but like the local animal shelter, going to walk dogs, there's other people there, running a 5K with a group of people for your local breast cancer charity, just something that gets them. So again, hopefully you're hearing here, it's somatically based, but the psyche is there too. And the psyche is that connection piece.
I've asked you a lot of questions about your work with clients, but I also know that you spend a lot of time educating. And I would love to hear from you if there are places that you've noticed where clinicians genuinely have blocks, or genuinely it's like they are struggling with their own embodiment, or places where, if you are a clinician, um, where you kind of need to grow yourself to offer this to people.
Mhm. Oh gosh, I think I can only speak to my own experience here,
Mhm.
but for me, it's around worthiness and taking up space. So over the last year, that has been my MO, and I'm doing that both somatically and cognitively in my work. So it's asking for what I deserve. It's better time management because I am a chronic overfunctioner. Like I will work and I will work and I will work. So bringing back on that, I've gained 10 pounds. So like when I say taking up space, I literally mean like a better job of taking up space, getting stronger, not necessarily to look better. Like I guess that's a bonus, but I just want to be here. I want to feel better taking up space. And I think for a lot of clinicians, we are overfunctioners. We get our value out of helping others and we forget ourselves.
Mhm. Are there gaps that you've noticed in clinicians' education when they come out of a master's program where they're going through some of the ASEC training? Are there some areas or some gaps that you've consistently noticed?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I would say the places that consistently blow people's minds are around kinks and fetishes, not really understanding those, pathologizing them. Justin Lehmiller's work is great here. So tell me what you want. So Justin Lehmiller's work, Tell Me What You Want, really looks at the top, kind of the most common kinks, fetishes, fantasies in the US. He's out of the Kinsey Institute. Um, what else is a block? Yeah, it's really pathologizing things that we don't even know that we're doing because we've just been so steeped in the culture of sex negativity. So, Allie, I know you've heard me say this cajillion times, but my definition of sex positivity is all sex is good sex as long as it's consensual and pleasurable. So I still check myself on this, however many years later. So it's hard to shock me anymore, but I still get surprised by my clients, which I love. So someone will bring in a new kink that I haven't heard about, and I'll be like, whoa, okay. And then I'll just check the boxes. Is that consensual? Is that pleasurable? If it is, have no business judging this whatsoever. Now, if it's not consensual, holy cow, all kinds of alarm bells are going out off. That's not okay. And if it's not pleasurable, if it's bringing them into shame, then again, we need to work on it.
How did you come to that definition?
Oh, I heard it so long ago, and I wish I could tell you who said it. It was at one of my ASEC trainings, probably back in like 2009. It was a long time ago,
A while ago.
but I love it.
Is there anything that you could advise people who are looking for a clinician to look for when they are choosing someone and they want to explore both their sexuality, but also the relationship they have with their body?
Mhm. Again, I think if you're looking to explore your sexuality, probably don't go to a generalist and just someone with just kind of the basic LMFT or social worker. You want someone with at least some training in human sexuality. And there are lots of ways to get trained. There's ASEC, there's IBOSC, which I'm involved with. There's Modern Sex Therapy Institutes. There's a lot of ways to get at least a base education in human sexuality. What else? Oh, like I said, within that, so you find a collection of sex therapists, and then really, what do you want to work on? If you're a queer person, I might suggest finding someone who works with that population or is queer themselves, someone in non-monogamy. Not all sex therapists are going to be great at non-monogamy. So really do your research here. And nowadays, I feel like most therapists have really great websites describing who they are and how they work.
With the aspects of somatics, is there anything that you could advise people to look for in their clinician to know that they're actually finding someone who has that that bridge between sexuality and somatics?
Mm-hmm. If it's not on their website, I think you just need to ask, do you have any training in somatic psychology? Are there any ways that you bring the body into the work? Saying something like, my body feels like a key piece of my process of recovery or my process of better self-awareness. How do you work with the body in your practice?
And this aspect for those who've experienced sexualized violence or sexual trauma or sexual violation, as you named it, what would they look for in a therapist?
That's a little tougher because almost all therapists have trauma training. There's no way you can get through your master's program and not have trauma training. That is a great place to start. If you have sexual trauma, there's just some flavors of sexual trauma that are a little bit different than trauma in general, a little bit different than complex trauma, a little bit different than childhood abuse or other types of abuse or even violence. So again, I was thinking I would just say, do you have training in sexual trauma?
Would you mind saying what those flavors are, how you kind of differentiate them?
Oh my gosh, that's a huge question. I talk about it a lot in my book. Um, it's mostly shame and what informs that shame as complicitness. So
Mm,
Brene Brown obviously talks about shame in such a great way. What I add to it is with sexual trauma, we feel complicit. So with someone that is stranger raped, so stranger rape happens about 18% of the time. Most sexual trauma is perpetrated by someone known to the survivor. But in cases of stranger rape, there isn't that internalized shame to such a great degree because those people can say, this happened to me,
mhm,
right? I was just walking down the street minding my own business. This happened to me. Whereas in most sexual trauma, survivors will just say, this is what happened because
mhm.
they feel like they had something to do with it. And in no way, shape, or form am I saying stranger rape is better than most sexual trauma. It is not. Stranger rape, you have a whole different collection of issues, safety, flashbacks, PTSD, just complete loss of control. It's a different collection of experiences and symptoms for most sexual trauma.
How do you support someone with that shame?
That's, so what I call it is helping them to let themselves off the hook. And this is
Mm,
a months-long process of just really, as you spoke to beautifully before, helping them to understand that their psyche and their body was really just in service to keeping them safe, not in service to betraying them.
mm. That sounds like something that line of like in service of keeping them safe often feels like in my practice, the thing my clients don't know about their body is that it's actually fully working for them to be well in the world isn't something that needs to be maintained and curated or controlled as intensely.
Beautifully said. Yes.
How do you work with people to help them into that awareness that their body is actually there for them, not against them?
We do things where that shows up, right? So go out for a walk, go out for a run, go swimming. Look, your body is working just fine. If it's sexual dysfunction issues, usually there's sexual dysfunction when they're in a partnered experience, but there's not when they're masturbating. So again, we're like, okay, well, so this is about anxiety. This is about vulnerability. This is nothing wrong with your body. It takes a while to convince people that there's nothing wrong with their body because people walk in and like, that's it, I'm broken. I'm definitely broken. This is never going to get fixed. They're not broken. There's just some blocks there that we have to work through.
Are there some common misconceptions about embodiment or sexuality that you feel like you encounter often when people come into your virtual office space?
hmm Um, I think they believe that they're supposed to know how to have sex, like just you're born and all of a sudden you know how to have great sex. That's a misconception. There's a lot of misinformation or missing information about anatomy. How many people, especially vulva owners who don't know how things happen. Um, what else do I hear? Just not prioritizing pleasure, that sex is supposed to feel good, just a lot around the ways my body is not doing what I think it's supposed to do, or Everybody should be easily able to have an orgasm when they've never even tried kind of in an intentional way to have an orgasm. There's a lot of blocks.
My last question for you today is, what is one thing you wish people knew about their body?
That it's got you.
Mm.
Yeah, that it's got you. Sometimes my words for it is our body goes without us. So sometimes our body will get a subconscious or unconscious clue, and it will be off to the races with some symptom manifestation that is really, again, an attempt to keep us safe, but it feels very out of our control, and that's really hard. That gets better. So I am a somaticizer. So that's someone whose body knows what's going on far before their head catches up. And I would like to think of myself as a smart person, but man, my body was running the show for a while and I just couldn't make that connection. Now, years later, sometimes my body will still go without me, but I can talk myself down from that in a much quicker and more effective way. So I think it's just, yeah, that your body's got you. Nothing is forever. Everything heals. When we're talking about those somatic manifestations, I'm not talking about big medical problems here, obviously. But most of the time, we can bring that body and our nervous system right back online and get us into that flexible zone.
I love that. I've never heard that your body goes without you. Is that, yeah,
Mhm.
I've never heard that saying before, but yeah, it has so much truth. Especially when I apply it to my own life. I'm also a somaticizer as well. And so definitely that's what will occur when I'm unable to hear the thoughts in my mind or unable to feel what is actually happening in my body. I'm too overwhelmed. It will show up quite quickly for me. Thank you so much for your time today. It was so lovely to get to spend some time with you, ask you some questions. There'll be a ton of links in the notes so people can connect with you. Is there anything else before we close?
Oh my gosh, a wonderful conversation. I always love chatting with you. It's good to be connected, and I love hearing about the work you're doing in the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own